Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of about 75 organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And our guest today is Malcolm F. Purinton. And Malcolm, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Malcolm is an assistant teaching professor of history at Northeastern University, author of Globalization in a Glass, the Rise of Pilsner Beer through Technology, Taste, and Empire, and also a columnist for the Yankee Brew News. He's a beer historian and also an historian of early America and empire. And so, Malcolm, you've said that in many ways the American Revolution is really a result of the tavern culture. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit of what you mean.
So we have to think about exactly like what was the colonial society in early America. A lot of it was, transplants, from England especially, and their way of gathering as a community. And a big piece of that was through the tavern culture. Now you have the pub culture in England, but a lot of the people that were coming over, especially if we're looking at the Northeast, we're looking at people who were, fleeing religious persecution, wanting their own kind of like their own type of culture and society. And so among the very first things that people would be building, aside from homes, the first buildings for the community would be, a meeting house, for church, for services, and then also a tavern almost immediately afterwards. This was a place that, aside from the meeting house, which would be, gatherings, especially in warmer weather, when you have your sermons, you have your nice religious gatherings, but especially in the winter months, when it got a bit colder, the meeting houses wouldn't have any type of warmth. They wouldn't have fireplaces.
Yeah.
Now, the tavern wasn't just a place to imbibe alcohol, beer, hard cider, wine, spirits. It was a place that you could stay warm, between services. You have a morning service, evening service, you go to the tavern, perhaps have some warmth from the outside and some warmth for the inside. The tavern was a place where basically everyone would gather for news.
Yeah.
People not coming through towns. People would be, getting read from the newspaper, things like that. So the tavern was really a central part of how people built community in early America.
You make a point, too, that by law, towns had to build a tavern, and often the ministers wanted it right next to the meeting house.
Oh, yeah, that's actually, that's one of my favorite little things to talk about. Concord, Massachusetts was actually threatened with fines because they did not have a house of common entertainment, basically a safe space, a tavern in town. And so they immediately after a year or two, they did actually build their tavern for the town. Because we also have to think about the tavern for the town, a place of common entertainment,
Right.
would also be called an inn or an ordinary. I mean, the ordinary the term itself kind of, says everything. It was so ordinary, it was just part of every single community.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just a place for the local community. Why this place would be necessary by law, by the Massachusetts Supreme Court, was because it was also a place for travelers to stop by. We don't have, large hotels, we don't have large inns. You had to have a place for people, when they're on their way from one place to another, towns being, not necessarily next to each other. You needed a place for horses to be fed and watered, as well as for men and women and children to be fed and watered. And so if you didn't have a place of, where people could stop by, spend the nights, get some victuals, then where else would they go? You might find them in someone's barn. You might find them lying on the side of the road. You might find them knocking on your door.
Yeah, right. And also they would have court sessions and other public meetings in taverns.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in the colder months. I mean, if you did not have, if you were having a court session in the middle of wintertime, you would not be going to the meeting house.
Right.
Churches, meeting houses, they would not have the fireplace. Everything's made of wood, so everyone has that fear of fire. The tavern would have a very large fireplace, place to keep warm. And, that's usually where you'd go from the court sometimes, and then they would continue their discussions into the tavern, sometimes with or without some liquid encouragement as well. They would also have elections. A lot of times, town and city, events would be held in those taverns, because that would be a place for news. That'd be a place to make news as well.
Mhm. And in Boston, you have this wonderful map you show of how many taverns there are in Boston, how many, and the number seems to grow exponentially in the 18th century. I wonder why this is, or what you see happening with this.
It's a big transition in the 18th century. So Boston had become, like the early part of the 18th century, we're looking at kind of like the pirate times, like we're looking at kind of you're looking at the the French American War, the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, and what you're seeing is Boston is becoming a cosmopolitan city, one where you have people from all over the world. They're coming to this major port city, a lot of times to live, a lot of times to stay for a certain period of time. So as the numbers grew, you had taverns, but you also saw certain taverns becoming focused on specific clientele. So the first taverns, so ones through the 16th century, would generally be, you would have everybody, regardless of social class, all going to the same taverns, because there were very few of them. By the 18th century, we're seeing a stratification of society, where certain groups, would be going to certain taverns. So the higher upper class, the politicians, like Hancock, they would be going to one type of tavern. Then you have the working class, say like the working men on the docks. They would have their own taverns, and all in between. But you also had a shift in types of drinking. So while these taverns could be, especially for the upper class, you'd have the courts, nearby, and then you'd probably adjourn to or continue discussions in those taverns. You would have people drinking beer, cider, sometimes wine, but we're seeing the increase of rum production and consumption in the 18th century, because Boston's part of the British Empire, right? These are British colonies. So the most important colonies for the British Empire were the ones that were making the most money, which were the ones in the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands, Barbados especially. And so, one of those offshoots of, making nice refined sugar is molasses. So what do you do with this leftover stuff? You can distill it into rum. And, well, New England had most of those rum distilleries. So you had a lot of rum producers and rum consumers in that period of time. So while the population went up, you had people also going to these taverns for lesser than savory, options.
Interesting. Jonathan points out that tavern licenses per capita today are fewer than they were 250 years ago. So not only were there more there might have been fewer taverns, but there were more taverns per capita then than there are now. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that statistic, but it's interesting to think about.
Oh, absolutely. It's actually extremely difficult to get a liquor license today in Boston. Extremely, it's usually one that's kind of passed down, or you can, if you have one, you can sell it. It's usually kind of like a secondary market as well.
Yeah. I had a bad experience with what happened in taverns 250 years ago, I guess. So they want to. But you mentioned that they become gathering places for certain kinds of people, but then Samuel Adams is someone who seems to be able to move between them. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Samuel Adams, because he does. There's one popular image of him, the happy guy you see on the beer bottles, but that's not really the Samuel Adams I think that existed.
Yeah, the image or the person. Because Samuel Adams did not come from a brewing family. They were maltsters, so they're the ones that were getting the grain ready to then be brewed into beer. Though he wasn't really big on his business acumen. He was much more of like the political rabble-rouser. So while he was walking between these different stratified levels of society, he was able to walk through those areas and get the people in all those different taverns join into the cause of revolution. So those causes for this idea of an American freedom, of an American, independent nation. And so he was able to kind of get those different groups, for instance, the gangs of Boston, to join into becoming really kind of one gang. You can call themselves, the Sons of Liberty eventually. Yeah. So you had one of the neat things about kind of Boston, you have to picture the Boston of then, the peninsula, the Shawmut Peninsula, a very thin one road going in and out. And you had the north end, just as we do. You got the south end, just as we do, but not surrounded by so much land as we do today. They were
Yeah.
very kind of like specific areas on this relatively small peninsula. So you had the South End gang, you had the North End gang,
Mhm.
and one time a year, Guy Fawkes Day, and talking about remember the 5th of November.
Mhm.
These two gangs would, kind of have their moment in the night where
Mhm.
they were allowed to let themselves go.
Right.
With they would each make up. Got to think about this as it's a Protestant community
Yeah.
where they're not very big on the Pope or Catholics, and so each group, each gang would kind of create their own Pope effigy, and then move. The South End would move to the north, and the North End would come down towards the south. And along the way, they would stop in every single tavern along the way to make sure that those
Right.
tavern owners were on their side.
Right.
And if they weren't, then they might find some of their windows broken, things of that nature. And they'd be imbibing along the way. And then eventually they would meet up in the middle and kind of have it out, just fists, nothing too big. And, whoever won the other person's pope, then they take those two popes to their space and burn them in effigy. Now, eventually, as this kind of gets moving on, these
Mhm.
gangs start getting kind of brought together,
Mhm.
through their tavern cultures, through the
Mhm.
workings of Samuel Adams.
Right.
Getting them to start seeing themselves as
Mhm.
not an isolated gang in Boston on the peninsula, but as part of a larger idea, part
Mhm.
of a commonwealth, part of a country.
Mhm.
That's where I start seeing a transition towards that later half of the 18th century, where we're seeing
Mhm.
everything kind of coming together towards that revolution.
Mhm. I'm wondering, Malcolm, we're talking with Malcolm Purinton, author of Globalization in a Glass, The Rise of Pilsner Beer Through Technology, Taste, and Empire. Now, I'm wondering, in addition to these different taverns for different folks on the Patriot side, if there are gathering places for those who want to remain loyal to the crown. I mean, is Thomas Hutchinson and his sons going to a certain tavern, or are there such places for a safe space for loyalists?
Oh, absolutely. As we start seeing stratifications in society for different taverns, we also see political divides as well.
Right.
So you definitely had groups that would be going towards, during the occupation of Boston, for instance, you have a
Mhm.
lot of the British regulars, the Redcoats, going to their specific taverns.
Mhm.
And you had, South End gang, you had, Ebenezer McIntosh's group going to their place.
Mhm. Right.
Separations within Boston, but also across Massachusetts. The Golden Bell Tavern, still standing today, which you can go visit
Right.
over the summer.
Yeah.
They were known to be a loyalist tavern.
Mhm. Right.
One that housed a number of different loyalist spies during the Revolution too.
Yeah.
So you see political divides for different taverns. Once you reach a number of taverns that you can have that type of distribution, and those tavern owners can still make enough money.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Is the Golden Ball the only one in that town, or is there another tavern that, do you know?
Still standing today.
Yes, it
Still
is.
standing
Okay. Yeah.
today.
I'm
Yeah.
just wondering if there was another place. Yeah, because in Boston, another tavern you talk about, and you are a Vermonter, is the Catamount Tavern in Bennington. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those guys.
As being born and raised Vermonter myself, I'm always kind of look towards Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, and I mean perhaps less fondly than I did when I was a child, learning exactly who they were.
Right.
Ethan Allen was known for not only his revolutionary ideas, but also his level of imbibing, which was extensive. So the Catamount Tavern, Bennington, Vermont, which was also the name, Catamount was also one of the very first craft beer breweries in Vermont, the Catamount Brewery.
When
The
was
Catamount
this?
Tavern.
More recent? Was this a more recent craft brewery?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. They're actually still produce some, Harpoon actually still produces some of their beers too.
Okay.
Their Windsor, Vermont facility.
Mhm.
So Catamount, the tavern in Bennington, that was kind of the gathering point for the Green Mountain Boys. So Ethan Allen, his brother Ira Allen, all of their merry men.
Yeah.
And as we see the siege of Boston occurring, so after Paul Revere and Hawes and everybody, after, and Prescott, after the midnight rides,
Right.
we see all of the, the rebels, perhaps, the Patriots coming and surrounding the peninsula of Boston.
Mhm.
But they come to a standstill, going from April through, you have this stalemate because, the British control the harbor with all of their
Mhm.
ships, and the land is controlled by the Patriots. And so what they need is cannon. Now, one place that did have a lot of good cannon was Fort Ticonderoga. So north of Lake George, New York, southern end of Lake Champlain. And the Green Mountain Boys are making some plans, with Henry Knox, with Benedict Arnold, before he becomes the bad guy, coming to meet up there, get these cannon, and bring them back to Boston. Now, Fort Ticonderoga is still held by the British. Right. Now, the Green Mountain Boys, while they're hanging out at the Catamount Tavern, they're getting towards middle of the night. They're kind of like, why should we wait for these guys? Let's just head on over there right now. It's the middle of the night. We'll be able to surprise them. This will be totally work out. Totally great. So they managed to get themselves over to the river, to the end of the lake, and find some ships. About then, Benedict Arnold and his crew showed up at Catamount. Green Mountain Boys have already left. Arnold is pissed, but they all meet up at these boats just before dawn and slowly make their way across over to Fort Ticonderoga. So you have that meeting point. The tavern's always going to be the meeting point. Right. That's where everybody's going to know where to go. They're going to get their news. That's where they're going to meet. It's the one place in town that everybody's going to know about. So they're able to get to Fort Ticonderoga, take it over with minimal hassle, and Henry Knox takes that cannon all the way back to Boston to eventually end that siege of Boston.
Right, yeah. Now, one of the things that comes up, these guys are gathering in taverns, and that might lead to a perception that they are perpetually drunk. I wonder if we can talk both a little bit about that, as well as about what is the alcohol content of what they're drinking? What are the drinks of the day that you would have found in a tavern?
That's a good question. So now with Ethan Allen, yes, he was generally inebriated. But for the most part, these taverns were, again, the ordinaries. They're also known as inns and places of entertainment. So they were the spot for travelers. A lot of times, hard cider ended up being one of the most imbibed, libations. Beer, somewhat. Beer production was still a lot, many times a home brew situation. For most of human history, women were the primary brewers of beer. I'm talking about for thousands and thousands of years. Because it was part of just the home domestic tasks that were happening. And so what we see, though, in the 18th century, as I mentioned before, is the increase in rum production and consumption. So in the higher levels of the stratified society, you'd see a lot of wine, especially imperial wine, being consumed, and you'd see a lot of hard cider. Think about Johnny Appleseed, Leominster, Massachusetts. He was not planting like pink ladies and rock and beach. He was planting hard, knobby, very tart types of apples, specifically for hard cider production. So that's what was the focus. It was really a big piece. Samuel Adams was actually advocating, as the revolution started getting going, that everyone should be drinking American-made beer because it could show for the patriotic cause. Right. The wine was being imported through British importers. The rum was very much a British imperial drink. And so depending on where you were and the part of the evening, people could be drinking, straight rum. They could be drinking some beer. Could be drinking, a lot of hard cider, sometimes wine, but also mixtures of all of the above. Sometimes they would have flip. They love putting eggs and different types of things into beer. They would also heat it up. So a flip would be, usually a mixture of some beer, some cider, possibly some rum, and egg, and you'd heat it all up with a poke, like a hot poker, and it'd be frothing over. Wow. So they love to mix everything together. Actually, Ethan Allen was a big fan of the snake bite, which was hard cider and rum together. Wow. So beer itself would be around like really low alcohol, 4 to 6% tops, alcohol by volume. Your rum could be up there around 50%, like 50 proof. The wine standard, as we kind of think of today, 12 to 14%. And the hard cider could vary anywhere from like really 7 up to 16% itself. So it kind of depended. Thomas Jefferson, well known for having 2 pints of hard cider every single morning with breakfast. This is a period of time. It's actually a pretty good book called The Alcoholic Republic by Loribar that speaks to, he really focuses on how much people were drinking in the American colonies and then the early republic or like early country from 1750 to 1830. So the drinking per capita was on levels which no one has ever really seen
Yeah,
since then.
it's amazing. In the middle of the 1700s, there's a big public health crisis in London caused by gin. It's newly introduced. And does that happen here as well, the whole gin craze?
No, actually, we don't see very much evidence of that here at all. But we also see the gin. Really, it's almost like a gin pandemic. I mean, the levels of
Yeah.
people that were dying
Oh,
from
yeah.
gin consumption was just horrendous. And you don't see much gin production here because you're looking at the specific spirits that are being produced. So we're looking at like, very clean, like grain liquor being distilled in London that was part of that gin. And look at the laws too, which made gin much cheaper than say beer. Because the beer production in London at this time is huge. I mean, it is and growing. In the 18th century, we're seeing like the popularity of a brand new style called the porter. We're seeing really the industrialization of beer for the first time. And so beer is huge in London, also places like Burton upon Trent and Liverpool and Manchester. But we're seeing gin becomes eclipsed mostly through taxation and pricing it out more than anything else. But we don't see that necessarily here. What we see really more pushes against the imperial drinks. That's why rum is being like frowned upon. Seeing, I think it was Patrick Henry who was actually given some real shade for serving homebrewed beer to a bunch of politicians instead of his usual rum production, like rum that he would have done. But he was like, no, it's a patriotic drink. We have to stick with this. So you don't see that type of epidemic going on here in the colonies at all.
We're talking with Malcolm Purinton, author of Globalization in a Glass, The Rise of Pilsner Beer Through Technology, Taste, and Empire. I'm just wondering, Malcolm, how is the beer being imported today? Heineken, other beer, Dos Equis come in bottles. Was the beer being shipped in bottles?
Primarily wooden casks, so wooden kegs. Bottles are only starting to come around in the really kind of like the early 19th century, and then not with like the cap that we think of today. It would be corked and caged usually, and it was much more expensive. As we see the industrialization of the glass industry, we start seeing glass as being something that is cheaper to produce, and then you can also use that for bottling. But for the most part, we're seeing beer production being tied to lots of different industries. Whether that is, coopers, the ones who are making those wooden casks specifically for beer, but also wine, also whiskey. And that would be what would be being sent over on ships if it's being transported across. I mean, the domestic production of beer was, decent. Enough so that you did not see very much like beer being sent across, across the Atlantic. You're seeing different goods. You're seeing malted grains, you're seeing hops and other ingredients being sent back and forth, but not the finished product itself.
I know that Franklin has a couple of casks of porter that he serves to the delegates at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, imported from England. He writes to his friend who had sent them. So, and you think of these casks really then are primarily meant for taverns then, as opposed to home consumption, unless you're someone like Franklin who has a big house and entertain a lot.
Oh yeah, no, we're definitely looking at this not generally for home consumption. The home consumption would be on a much smaller scale, and also be a beer that you would be producing and consuming on a weekly basis, because that homebrewed beer would be very low in alcohol, and so it would also be seen as safer because you don't have sewage facilities. You don't see don't see that. So you'd see like table beers or small beers being produced. That would be something you'd have for breakfast. Something you'd have like while harvesting in the fields. Something that you would serve to children, because it was you have to think about it as food as well as something that you could drink to excess outwards.
Right. And also, Malcolm, you make the point that one reason that beer is popular is because it's safer to drink than water.
Yeah. I mean, this goes back to really the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. If we look at the Mayflower, for instance, one of the reasons, they weren't looking for this rock in Plymouth. They were trying to get, beyond the Cape. But because they left so late, and, the ship itself was one that had been used for many years, was not in great condition. And they were running out of beer. Most importantly, they were running out of beer. William Bradford writes about this because, they had hired this ship. And so while the water will go bad pretty quickly, the beer itself had, keeping qualities, including alcohol, but primarily the hops that are being used, which acted as a preservative to allow that beer to, keep out bacteria and other things that would make it go bad for weeks to months at a time. And so those sailors needed enough beer to not just drop off all of the pilgrims here, but also to get all the way back across the Atlantic. So when we see, the next big, influx of people with the Puritans, with the Arabella, well, the Arabella itself, among the many ships, had enough beer for 4 pints per person per day, man, woman, and child, just to make sure. So they learned exactly, what happened. And really, we see 1620 for the Mayflower, and by 1633, we have the very first licensed tavern in Boston, Cole's Inn on the peninsula, which was actually it was 1 year. It was 1 year after the first church, 2 years before the first school. So we can see the priorities.
So we'll have to put that on the Boston 400 calendar, the opening of the first tavern.
They really should.
2033.
Definitely. That sounds good.
And I'm wondering if we can talk then a little bit more about the Green Dragon, because that's a place that did the Masons own that? And it was also their meeting place?
Yeah. So one of the Masonic lodges. So Masonic lodges were very important to these colonial communities. Both at this period, but also going through the 19th century, because they acted as kind of fraternal brotherhoods, but places where groups of people, men, could come and discuss politics of the day, discuss the events, and, plan things like elections or revolutions. So the Green Dragon is one such place.
Yeah.
It was then purchased by the Freemasons. They would meet there regularly. People including Prescott, Dawes, and Revere, and everybody. They would all come there and meet up. And they would have their meetings in this tavern because, that's where people would meet, in the taverns. But this place, we see them first becoming the Loyal Nine. So they go kind of, their first kind of secret revolutionary group was the Royal Nine that then, would eventually become the broader Sons of Liberty. But they would plan revolutionary activities, including the burning of a ship in Narragansett Bay, for instance. The sacking of the governor's house, but also, perhaps most famous, on the same night where you see a big, meeting at the Meeting House, the South End Meeting House, where we see, talking about, the Tea Act. What was going on with the Green Dragon was the Sons of Liberty were getting together, dressing themselves up like Mohawk Indians, to go down and. The original plan was just kind of take control of the tea. But they were getting ready for apparently a long time. And so imbibing quite a bit along while they were getting themselves made up. And so they ended up getting there and tossing over all of that tea. Millions of dollars worth of tea with the Boston Tea Party. So the tavern played a role through many decades of different levels of revolutionary activity, going from the initial meetings, discussing politics, discussing what freedom and liberty are, to then leading active revolutionary activities like burning of ships and throwing tea into the Boston Harbor.
Now, are there taverns in other colonies, or is Massachusetts or the New England colonies unique in having such a strong tavern culture?
Well, in some ways unique, in some ways not. All the other colonies did have taverns, and a lot of them did also have, laws that required them to have places of entertainment. So inns, they would call them different names, of course, but it'll be the same type of structure used for the same purposes. So you have laws in Virginia, in the Carolinas, and so forth, calling for towns being required to also have taverns, inns, and so forth, because people need places to stay. These were the bed and breakfasts of the earlier times that also served alcohol. It was a place where even if it didn't get too cold, they would still need a place to hold meetings, whether that was a Freemason meeting or an election by the politicians of the town or the local communities, but it was also just a place that allowed for more safety for the local population, for all of these travelers that just needed a place to stay, a place to, feed and water their horses and kind of keep things going. So Benjamin Franklin, one of his great ideas is having a, colonial wide, post office, a way to spread the news from Philadelphia, from Boston, from New York to Charleston, to all of these other cities, to draw everyone together to be like, hey, listen, we're actually part of the same group in the same place, not just a bunch of very individual colonies. So where people generally meet, where people generally get mail, they'd probably be going to the tavern before you had an established post office. Right. The tavern keeper was not just a tavern keeper. They were also a cook. They were also a brewer. They were also a server. They were also the postmaster general. A lot of times they would also be a local judge. A lot of times they would also be, the one who would spread the news from town to town and so forth. The first people to hear about what was going on and the last people to go to sleep at night.
It's interesting. We're talking with Malcolm Purinton, author of Globalization in a Glass. I'm wondering too, there's a Green Dragon Tavern in Boston today. Is that the same tavern that we've been talking about from the Revolutionary period?
No, not even close. Not even close. I do appreciate that they have that it does exist in some form, but no, the Green Dragon of yore was, I think it was burned by fire in like the middle of the 19th century, I think. So a long time ago. So you see kind of like the resurgence of kind of these ideas about the revolution, who was where at what point, really kind of coming through more in the 19th century than you saw at the end of the 18th century. And so that's when you start seeing places like the Bell in Hand and the Green Dragon coming up and being, across Faneuil Hall, places for people to go to kind of, bring a tie to that colonial history.
Right. And Philadelphia has recreated the City Tavern, which was a big gathering place. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, God, it was such an important space. I mean, everybody was there. Everybody was there.
Yeah. I'm wondering, because I was just thinking as you were talking, that Washington and others are trying to go from tobacco to wheat and grain. And so I'm wondering if that's why we then see a rise in the production of bourbon and other kinds of alcohol after the revolution as opposed to rum. I mean, it just occurred to me as you were talking.
Oh, I mean, corn whiskey becomes a central part of the early America, the early United States, which is why the very first, you have the Whiskey Rebellion.
The Whiskey Rebellion, right, yes.
It is huge because, after the American Revolution, suddenly the United States doesn't have any strong partners, like trading partners. Both because, while they might have had the French go on their own revolution pretty quickly after the American Revolution. So that's also a loss of a huge trading partner too. So in order to create a local production, a domestic kind of trading network, corn whiskey becomes a really big one. So while corn whiskey will have corn, you can also have rye, wheat, lots of different types of grains to distill into some form of whiskey. It becomes a really important piece of American identity too. While it was part of people's livelihoods, which is why they did not want the whiskey to be taxed by this new federal government, which is why they fight for that during the rebellion, which does get put down relatively quickly. It's the first real threat to the early country.
Yeah.
But it really kind of emphasizes the importance of this substance, but also what is the control of kind of states versus federal government. We're seeing, are we a bunch of colonies that now become states, or are we a country that is run by a federal government? And so we see that tied directly to that alcohol production.
It's fascinating. We're talking with Malcolm Purinton, author of Globalization in a Glass. I think just we could go on talking all day, but it's almost noon, and I know what you're probably going to start doing once the sun is over the yard arm. What about these apple trees that Johnny Appleseed planted? All these apples, you talked about these hard knobby things, they're like crab apples. So what happens to all those trees?
They live a pretty good life for the 19th century. I like a pretty good one. I mean, like, he made it all the way out to the Ohio area.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it was also hard cider is just as easy today to make today as it is
Yeah.
before. I mean, I've been home brewing for decades now, and I made some hard cider. It is very, very easy to do. There's already yeast on that, on the outside of that apple. You don't even need to add anything else. But what happens to Johnny Appleseed's trees is, like most things in the 1920s, involved alcohol, they get destroyed. So you actually saw just acres of apple orchards being just completely just cut down and burned. So that's what happened to most of those. I mean, you don't see a growing cider industry until really the past like 15 to 20 years. Going along with the craft beer revolution, you saw a craft cidery revolution going alongside that too. So that's what ends up happening to most of those Johnny Appleseed trees.
Interesting. Do you also make beer?
Oh yes, yeah, I've been doing that since college. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Just making my own porters, brown ales. A lot of them I don't really fit to any particular style. It's just kind of what type of flavor would I like, and what type of ingredients do I want to mess around with? 5-gallon batches for fun.
Yeah, I have a former student. He's actually involved with Lexington in upstate New York, and he has a farm. He came to Boston, became a teacher, but he began making beer as a hobby in his apartment in the North End, and it was terrible at first. But now he actually has a brewery, and he's won awards for his beer. So it's
nice. Oh, I'd love to get his details then.
I'll put you in touch with him, because I know you are the guy looking for investigating modern beer making. Did the folks in Massachusetts grow hops and the other ingredients to beer, or did they have to import those?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, like Massachusetts and Vermont became really big hop exporting regions. I mean, today we have 4-Star Farms, which is in Western Mass. They actually have their own brewery too, but they're pretty much like the first real kind of local hop production farm of the 21st century, which is really great. Upstate New York actually then becomes eclipses everybody. Becomes not only like one of the major bread baskets for the early country, but also really important for hop growing and barley growing for beer production especially. Yeah.
Well, thank you. We've been talking with Malcolm Purinton, author of Globalization in a Glass, The Rise of Pilsner Beer Through Technology, Taste, and Empire, columnist for the Yankee Brew News, and an assistant teaching professor of history at Northeastern University. Malcolm, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, Bob. Thanks so much for having me.
And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, the man behind the curtain, as well as our listeners. And Jonathan just told me he's been calculating, and that over the course of our podcast, we've had something like 170,000 people tuning into individual episodes, which is amazing, in 119 countries, 4,000 cities and towns. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in today and the other 250 plus episodes. And every week we thank some folks in different places. And if you're in one of these places and want some of our Revolution 250 swag, Jonathan, I know, is making more magnets and other things. Send him an email at jlane@revolution250.org. And this week, our listeners in Binghamton, New York, Seguin, Texas, Christiansburg, Virginia, Cape Town in South Africa, Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and in the great state of Ohio, in Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Amelia, Lee, Massachusetts, Knoxville, Tennessee, Kaohsiung, Taiwan, Oslo, Edinburgh, Tel Aviv, Mexico City, all places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us. And now we'll be piped out on the road to Boston.